Now, on to our speaker for today. David McCraw has spent the last 17 years at the New York Times Company, where he serves as the newsroom's top lawyer. In that role, he has been the Times' principal legal advisor on the WikiLeaks and Snowden disclosures, and on a range of Pulitzer Prize-winning stories, including the paper's groundbreaking reporting on Donald Trump's tax returns, Harvey Weinstein, the contamination of America's meat supply, and the secret fortunes of China's political elites. Mr. McCraw is one of the nation's most active litigators of freedom of information lawsuits. Over the past decade, the Times has brought more than 65 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the federal government. These suits have led to the disclosure of previous secret records about chemical weapons found in Iraq, the government's legal justification for drone killings abroad, and the identities of companies and individuals allowed to trade with sanctioned nations. His duties at the Times include acting as the company's crisis response manager. In that way, he's overseen the Times' response to the kidnapping of journalists in Afghanistan and the seizure of 4 other journalists by the Libyan government in the midst of civil war, and the emergency evacuation of reporters and photographers injured while covering conflict. Copies of his book, Truth in Our Times: Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts, is here and available for purchase in the lobby thanks to a partnership with Palm Beach Bookstore. And we hope that you'll join us after the program for the book signing. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the New York Times in-house general counsel, David McCraw.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for Richard for connecting me. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a great event, great audience, and I appreciate it. I have to say, though, my favorite stop on my book tour was in my hometown of Monticello, Illinois, population 4,100. My high school friends put it together. It was a great event. My English teacher was there from high school. My guidance counselor was there from high school. My 8th grade teacher was there. Parents of my friends in their 80s were there. And you can't go home again, but you can. And the thing that it reminded me of was that I learned to be a supporter and a lover of the First Amendment, not walking the streets of Manhattan, but walking the streets of Monticello, Illinois. Because if you were like me growing up in Illinois in the 60s and 70s, there was only one thing you really knew about politics, and that was this: the governor goes to jail. Yeah. Otto Kerner went to jail. Dan Walker went to jail. The third guy got off, hats off to the lawyers in the room. When the Secretary of State of Illinois, Paul Powell, died, they found shoeboxes full of money in his office. My parents were deeply conservative people. My mother was a World War II veteran. She was a nurse. My father was a World War II veteran. They had met during the war. And they held up as a conservative value the importance of a free press, because if anybody was going to stop those political officials from stealing, the only shot we had was if we had a free press. I've spent 17 years at the New York Times, and what I've tried to do in my book is convey one big lesson, and that's this: press freedom happens on the ground. It's not abstract. It doesn't hang around in the air of law schools. It happens on the ground, and it makes possible in a tangible way the day-to-day work of journalists. On a summer evening in June of 2017, I found myself at JFK Airport waiting for a flight to Paris. And I remembered that a reporter by the name of Jody Cantor had been looking for me. So before my flight, I called Jody back. And she laid out the story that she was working on. She was just starting. It was a story about how movie producer Harvey Weinstein, a major Times advertiser, I should add, was a serial abuser of women. Women who worked for him, women who starred in his movies, women who were looking to get their first break in Hollywood. I listened patiently to what Jody had to tell me. That's pretty much what I get paid to do when reporters call me. Now, those of you who have seen movies like The Post, the story of how the New York Times broke the Pentagon Papers, I never understand that. Steven Spielberg. The lawyers come off pretty badly in movies like that. The press lawyers all have sweaty palms, and they're all about to stand between the truth and history, all about to stand between journalism and freedom. And that's never been my role at the New York Times. We have been schooled by our management that our role as lawyers is to get stories in the paper and to help reporters do that. So I listened patiently to Jody, and she assured me of only one thing: we're going to get sued. I told her she should go ahead with her reporting and keep me posted, and as I hung up, I thought to myself, this is going to be no big deal. I had seen these things before: the hard stories, the threats, the inevitable public denouncing of the Times. Been there, done that. We would report the story, Weinstein would deny it. There would be a few weeks when it would be raining lawyers on my head, all of them insisting that the story was wrong, their client had done nothing, and that the Times would be sued if we didn't immediately retract the story, and then it would pass, and life would go on pretty much as always. Okay, in fairness, I was right about one thing, okay? It did rain lawyers that October, as Jody and her reporting partner Megan Toohey laid out in shocking detail Harvey Weinstein's misconduct. Harvey had an amazing array of lawyers. He had a libel lawyer, he had a corporate lawyer, he had an employment lawyer. The famous litigator David Boies was on his team. And in the run-up to the story, they lobbed letters at me, and I lobbed back responses as fast as I could. So I was right about that. The rest of it, not so much. It did set off, as we all know, a floodgate and unleashed the Me Too movement. As those stories rolled off our pages and our website in October of 2017, they served as something of a capstone for what had been a dizzying year that I had experienced, when day after day, press freedom and the First Amendment became a part of the national narrative. As the lead newsroom lawyer for the Times, I stood near the center of it, whether I wanted to or not. It had begun almost exactly a year earlier when I had written a letter to candidate Donald Trump's lawyers defending a Times story about two women who claimed they had been groped by Mr. Trump many years earlier. And my letter was suddenly all over the internet, an online tutorial on libel law, the First Amendment, and journalism. And over the next 12 months, it kept going. The trying moments, the showdowns with the government and with the powerful, all of it over the rights of a free press. In January of 2017, two of our reporters were closing in on a story about how the U.S. was launching cyber attacks against North Korea. The story was based on classified information. In the midst of the reporting, the White House counsel wrote to demand that we stop and that our publisher contact White House officials immediately. A month later, in February, the president's press secretary barred reporters from the Times and other disfavored news outlets from a White House press conference. In June, a government contractor with the unlikely name of Reality Winner was arrested for leaking classified secrets to a news organization, carrying on a long-running and ever-escalating campaign by the government to find and punish leakers. By July, the Times had been sued for libel by two of the president's most prominent supporters, coal magnate Bob Murray and former governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin. Then, throughout the summer and fall, came the stream of Me Too stories, with reporters asking women, many of whom had signed non-disclosure agreements, asking them to break their silence and tell their stories. And in the background was the steady drumbeat of a White House calling the news media, fake news, the enemy of the people, and before long, criminals engaged in treason. In the midst of those events and those attacks, I feared that people like me had not done a very good job of explaining how the First Amendment worked, why it was important, how it made journalism possible, why it needed to be valued. No matter how unhappy you might be about something you have seen in the newspaper or heard on TV, or even everything you've read in the newspaper and seen on TV. the First Amendment still mattered. So the book became, for me, a throwback the curtain book, an account of how journalism, unvarnished, unfolded day after day. The great, the not so great, the goofy, the serious, the funny, and how the law and lawyers fit into all of that. I'd really become aware of what I thought the gap was between the way the First Amendment works and people's understanding of it in October of 2016 during the election. I was kayaking with my son in San Diego. That meant that he was having a great day and I was having an awful one. It's really good to be young. And when I got dry and reasonably happy, I found my cell phone where we left it, and on it was a message from a reporter by the name of Sue Craig. Sue Craig had called and said, please call me back, and so I did. And Sue said, very nonchalantly, someone sent me pages from Donald Trump's tax return. I just found them in an envelope in my mailbox. Going, well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, as you remember, the tax returns had been the subject of about a year and a half of debate and conversation and campaign rhetoric. And so when I got back to New York, I went down to meet with Sue and the other reporters on that story, and I walked into a conference room, and it was just piled high with documents. And their goal was to try to find out whether those 3 pages from the 1995 tax returns, were the real deal. Were they authentic? I would be lying to you if I said we didn't fear being set up, that someone was trying to draw us into an incredible mistake, a mistake that we would not recover from easily. And so we were looking at these documents. The reporters had gone through all these public filings. Was there anything that could help authenticate that document? And there was one line on the document that looked really, really suspicious. It was the line that included the size of the loss. And it was a huge number. It was 915 million. And what was weird about was the 9 and the 1 had fallen down. They weren't in line with the rest of the number. And of course, it became the key to whether there were tax losses that would have continued and allowed Mr. Trump not to pay taxes for a sizable number of years. And over the next week, the reporters did a phenomenal job of reporting it. David Barstow, working on that story with Sue, came down to Florida. He found out who Donald Trump's tax accountant had been in 1995, found out he was still alive, found out that he was living in Florida, and ultimately induced him to come out from a gated community to have a bagel and coffee. It's one of the truths of journalism. That still works. If any of his students should pay attention to that. And he confirmed, he says, oh yeah, I remember that. That number was so big in 1995, my software could not do that. I had to type that number in with a selectric, and I guess I didn't get it quite lined up. So again, it was one of those days when when we went ahead with that story, a Saturday night, it began raining lawyers again. And I couldn't have been more certain of myself that we had this one right. The Supreme Court has said it 6 times, and that is when we receive truthful information and we have done nothing wrong to get it, and it's in the public interest, we are entitled under the First Amendment to publish it. That's how it works. That's what the First Amendment means. And I was so confident in that. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court said if there's some overriding interest that we have never seen, maybe that rule will be put aside. But it certainly wasn't going to be put aside for someone's tax returns. So I felt really confident, despite all the lawyer letters I was receiving and the notes that I was getting about how we'd violated the law and this and that. So the next day, I'm at Yankee Stadium when my cell phone rings, and it's Sue Craig, the reporter. And Sue says, have you seen the Washington Post? Now, Sue is from Canada, so I have to explain a little bit about baseball to her. We do not read the Washington Post while we're at the Yankee games, even when they're being beat by the Baltimore Orioles, and there would be better things to do with our lives. So she said, well, you should. So I look at the Washington Post, and there is a story that says the New York Times risked legal trouble by publishing Donald Trump's tax returns. And it was a phenomenal story. It was a wonderful story. It was a great story. There was only one thing wrong with it. It was completely wrong. It was just flat out wrong on the law. But of course, in Twitter world, that doesn't matter. That story was suddenly everywhere. It was being passed along. Even reporters from the New York Times were passing along. Sue Craig was saying, you told us we could do this, and now look at what the Washington Post was saying. So this controversy over whether we could do this unfolds over the next couple days. And finally, the New York Times legal correspondent does a story about it. And not surprisingly, he agrees with me. He says that the law is legal. He goes out and talks to all these experts. The law says it's legal. He goes out and interviews all these experts. And in fact, they agree that our position was right, which makes me happy because that meant I got to keep my job. But the great thing that happened during those days was this. The legal correspondent at Fox News weighed in. And he agreed with me. Now, in this country today, if the New York Times says you're right and Fox News says you're right, you are right. For those of you who knew me previously, it's probably as a result of the letter I wrote during the campaign, the 2016 campaign, and to remind you, because so much happens every day in this country now, that seems like a decade ago. But in 2016, the Times ran an article about two women who said they'd been groped by Mr. Trump earlier, much earlier. And the story had come to me as I was in the subway, as it turned out. I read it. I thought it was exactly what we should be doing. It set up forth a story that we found credible, but it gave all the facts, so if anybody wanted to question it, they could. Gave Mr. Trump's response, which was that I will sue you if you publish that. And we did publish it. And there became this frenzy that we see so often now on Twitter, on internet, on cable news, on the talk show, as the Trump campaign said that we were going to be sued. And so over the course of that Wednesday in October of 2016, I kept getting asked, have you seen a complaint? Have you seen a complaint? Have you been sued? Have you been sued? No, we haven't been sued. We haven't seen the complaint. So about 8 o'clock that night, Wednesday night, the head of PR for the Times emails me and says, I understand they're going to file their suit tonight. Now, I've been a lawyer long enough. I know one thing about filing a lawsuit. You have to find a court that's open. In New York, on a Wednesday night, that is the Bronx Criminal Court. A lot of really strange things happen in the Bronx Criminal Court, but the filing of a libel suit by a presidential candidate, probably not likely. So, the next day, about midnight, we finally got a letter from Mr. Trump's lawyer saying that we needed to retract the story. They're going to sue. I sat down the next morning, wrote a letter which I knew we were going to put online because the letter from Mr. Trump's lawyer was online. And I don't know a lot about being online. I've never been a YouTube celebrity, but I was fine with that. So I worked up this letter, which was, in my mind, a fairly standard response to a threat of libel, which I thought was not credible. And it went out, and as a lawyer, I devoted my career to openness and to transparency. I believe in openness and transparency, but you don't know how much you believe in openness and transparency until your employer puts your email and phone number on the internet. Which they did when they put up my letter because it was all there. So emails started streaming into me. I was getting one a minute, and then the pace picked up a little bit. And they were great. I have to say that for all of the toxic way the internet can work, people were respectful. Even people who disagreed with me were respectful. A lot of people wrote really nice things to me. I was proud of that letter, but the kindness was overwhelming. Parents said I've sent it to my kids. Law students said I've sent it to my parents. People from around the world responded to it. I found myself in a huge debate on whether you should use 2 spaces or 1 after a period. It went across the internet for a while. Then a young woman said, forget it, he's old. That's what they do. They put 2 spaces after the period. It's hard being out there. It's hard being out there. So, it was my 15 minutes of internet fame, and if you've ever had 15 minutes of internet fame, that's about 14 minutes and 30 seconds too long. And I actually took to the newspaper to write a column about what I've been through because I thought people misunderstood a little bit. A lot of people thought that I was part of some anti-Trump offensive, and that's just not how I saw it. My role was to take on anyone who was trying to silence the truth or wrap the government in secrecy. When people attempted to bully us or when officials were trying to conceal what the public deserved to know, it didn't matter to me what their politics were. I fought with New York's arrogant Democratic leaders. I sued the Obama administration more than 30 times for withholding information, and I took on the Republicans whenever they were trying to make America a less transparent nation. My job didn't change with the administration. My job was to do whatever I could do to make sure our reporters had a chance to pursue the truth and tell it as the best they could. Thank you. I was fortunate in the middle of this to get a historical perspective because I thought that was important, that this was more than this moment. And it came from a man named Clarence Jones, who was in his 80s. Clarence, in the early 1960s, was Martin Luther King's personal lawyer. Some of you will remember that the famous Supreme Court case Times versus Sullivan involved an ad in the New York Times brought by Martin Luther King's supporters. It became the basis for the famous decision Times versus Sullivan, which expanded press freedom in this country in ways that we'd never seen before and haven't seen since. But at the heart of that case was this ad that was placed by Martin Luther King's supporters, and L.B. Sullivan, a police commissioner in Alabama, sued, claiming he had been libeled by the ad. So Clarence Jones, Dr. King's lawyer from those days, wrote to me. And he said he wrote to thank the Times and the Sulzberger family, which owns the Times, for having stood up for the newspaper in the Sullivan case in 1964. Because when they stood up for the newspaper, they were also standing up for civil rights leaders, he wrote. Quote, all of my then 31-year-old self advised Dr. King and the Times that Sullivan's suit was an effort to silence the Times and decapitate the leadership of the Southern civil rights movement. We in the Times had no choice but to fight. We were fighting for our survival. And those words resonated with me. I would like to be able to tell you that the letter changed things, that we gained as a nation appreciation for the First Amendment. That obviously hasn't happened. 2 months after I wrote that letter, Donald Trump for the first time used the term fake news on Twitter. Over the next 2 years, he used it 364 times, and he called the press the enemy of the people 26 times. Obviously, there's much more, and we continue to debate this issue of a free press. But here's the point I wanted to leave you with. I don't worry when I think about the challenges to a free press. I don't worry about a change in the law. I don't worry about a change in the interpretation of the First Amendment. I don't worry about lawsuits, which will always come and we will continue to defend. What I really worry about is what I think of as the hearts and minds problem. That freedom of the press, in the end, does not depend on the words of the Constitution or what a judge says. It depends on all of us. It depends on the will of the people. While I was writing my book, Ipsos came out with a poll which showed that 26% of Americans, 1 in 4, believed that the president should be able to close news organizations that misbehaved. 26% believe the president should be able to close news organizations that misbehave. Whatever you think about the press, and we have our failings, that was not what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. Sometime in your life, you will wake up on a November morning And you will, it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat, you will wake up on a November morning and look at the election results and go, oh, what has happened here? And your next response is, we shouldn't have any more elections, right? I go to court, judges make wrong decisions. Any judges in the audience, I apologize to this, but sometimes some of the judges aren't as gifted as they could be and they get it wrong. My solution is not, let's end the judiciary as we know it, okay? We make those institutions better. We want to educate voters better. We want to make sure we have a top-flight judiciary. And the same thing is with the press. We do not give the president the power to close those media outlets that he disagrees with or that he finds, quote, misbehaves. What we ask for is that the news organizations double down, try to do better at what they're doing. One of the things that became, I guess, what I thought of as the hallmark in the book was a passage, which I'm just going to read. It's a very short passage, which really framed this in my mind. The law can do only so much. It can give the press the freedom to matter, but it can't make the press matter. Whether the press counted, whether it has a role to play, depends in the end on the will of the people. It doesn't really matter how much freedom the press has in a society if the press is not believed. A distrusted press is little different from a shackled press. It lacks the authority to mobilize public opinion against wrongdoing, corruption, and misguided policy. It has no voice to hold governments accountable. It gets ignored. And I'm pretty sure that at some point a disregard for the press will translate into a disregard for the law of press freedom. That is why it's, as in my mind, the belief in the concept and the importance of a free press really is something that is a public concern. It's not just a concern for lawyers and journalists, and I try every day to make that point clear. I think one of the great mistakes people on my side of this question have made is in embracing press freedom as a liberal value. It is not. It's an American value. And we do ourselves a disservice when we advocate as if it's not something that we all have a stake in. And I want to take you back, and this is going to seem like centuries ago, but to 2010. In 2010, Congress passed the most consequential libel bill in the history of the nation. I don't need to go into the details. It protected American publishers against foreign libel suits that are won overseas and then under legal regimes that do not value free speech and then are brought here to try to enforce those judgments. The Congress said that is wrong. American publishers, American broadcasters should not be silenced by court decisions won in countries that do not share our belief about free expression. And so they passed the Speech Act, which has been a wall to that sort of action being taking place in the United States, where libel winners from overseas cannot come to the United States and enforce those judgments. Here's the important thing, not the details of that legislation. Here's the important thing. That bill passed unanimously in the House of Representatives. That bill passed unanimously in the Senate. Every Republican and every Democrat voted for it. And my message today really comes back to that. We need to find our way back to that great American consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McCraw. Thank you. Your comments are timely and insightful, and you found several ways to make us laugh and have a great appreciation for your work, so thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going to test you a little bit.
Okay.
We'll see really how you do handle things in the newsroom. We'd like to have, we have 2 tables of students from Wellington High School, and they've joined us today, and we're going to have them ask questions. So if I can have the first student ask the question, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jordan Bergman from Wellington High School, and my team and I are absolutely ecstatic to be here. And my question is a 2-parter, so I'll go slow. Has social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, impact how the New York Times investigates and reports any news? And has it made it harder for mainstream media to do their jobs?
Okay, I have to tell everybody who wasn't out in the hall with me and these wonderful students, I said, please ask me an easy question. They did not laugh. It was game face, folks. So yeah, there's the proof of it. Yeah, so Twitter and social media have been both a blessing and a curse for mainstream media. We are able to push our stories out in ways that we had never imagined. We can reach so many people, and we shouldn't lose sight that Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the rest play an important part in that. But on balance, as you're suggesting, it has made everything harder. We become just another voice in this cacophony of voices out there. The ability of those platforms to spread disinformation, misinformation, real fake news is really quite extraordinary. And whenever I get asked this, the question is, well, what are we supposed to do about that? And it seems to me that our options are not the greatest, that we can have government regulation, which I think is a terrible idea. We can leave it to Mark Zuckerberg, which is almost as terrible. Not that I don't trust him, but do we really want this behemoth corporate monster telling us what to think? Or we can find a way to work it out ourselves. Let me just be long-winded one more step, and then we'll get to the second part, because I fear what's coming. And as you can imagine, in my job, I develop an incredible instinct of when an email is coming from a nut job. And I receive a lot of them, as you can imagine. People who, the right legal term, people who want me to know that the CIA has planted electrodes in their brains, and the New York Times is not covering it. They are 50% right. So I saw one that began, "Why did you write this book?" It was a night, I could see the first line in the preview. "Why did you write this book?" And I knew I did not want to read any further. At least not at night when I was tired, so I put it away. Next morning I came back to it, and it wasn't nutty at all. The woman wrote and said, "Why did you write this book? You should be writing for young adults. You should be writing for children. That's where the process needs to start, with better readers, people who understand how to digest online media, how to evaluate sources, how to separate the false from the true." And that, unfortunately, because it's both of those, is in my mind the solution. Unfortunately, because it's going to take a really long time, and we're going to have to work at it. But fortunately, because that's really consistent with American values. Back to you.
All right, second question.
Hi, I'm Matthew McGann from Wellington Speech and Debate, and once again, thank you for having us here. Just like Jordan, my question is also two parts. So first, have the continual cries of fake news over the past few years made it more difficult for media, such as the New York Times, to assert itself in the public eye? And secondly, how much impact does the power of the presidency have on how news is reported by major media outlets?
Wow.
Good luck with that.
I see we're out of time. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, obviously the repetition of fake news it does make it harder. It becomes an easy way to denounce the mainstream media. And here's the really toxic nature of that label, fake news, because it sounds like something people say when they're interested in pursuing the truth, when it's just the opposite. It is an invitation to label and dismiss rather than to read and discern, which is what we need. And it's a particular problem overseas where the worst governments in the worst places are now adopting that language. Only when they adopt it, it's not just criticism, It leads to fake news laws. It leads to physical attacks on journalists, both our international reporters who are there as well as their local reporters. And I fear that many people in those worst governments, in those worst places, think that it's a way to curry favor with the United States. That used to not be the case. I can assure you that in the past, in the Middle East in particular, governments worried that if they oppressed local reporters or they oppressed New York Times, Washington Post, BBC reporters, that they would answer to our ambassador and they risked their foreign aid. So I fear that that has been the overarching worst news about fake news. As far as the power of the president, see, I'm always a little bit put off when someone will say that, you know, the media is responsible for the election of Donald Trump. You gave him too much attention. And I started to think about the Iowa debates, and as I recall, he was standing in the middle of the stage. It would have been really hard to say, well, you know, Marco Rubio said this, and Jeb Bush was doing that. You know, the presidency, and just like the presidential candidates, they have a way of setting the agenda. Should the press be skeptical? Should it ask hard questions? Yeah, and I think pretty much that has gone on and done that. But inevitably, especially in a world with Twitter, the president's going to have, and other leaders are going to have, enormous ability to reach voters directly. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. You know, obviously, I think that many times the people are suspicious of the filter, the gatekeepers, if you will, that the mainstream media are. But at the same time, I think, again, it goes back to the point I was making earlier, we really need readers who are going to say, okay, I see that tweet and I see that story, and I'm going to do some thinking about it.
Thank you. All right, here's an excellent question. What do you do when you have a story that implicates national security? What notification or discussions do you have with the national security establishment before running the story?
Yeah. So, at the times, in the time that I have been there, we have had as a standard playbook that before we publish something that seems to be a sensitive national security secret, that our editors reach out to senior members of the national security community. And part of that's just good reporting. If we were doing a story about a major company, Johnson & Johnson, ExxonMobil, and it was critical, we would call them up and check our facts and get their response and so forth. So that's carried over into our national security reporting. People misunderstand that. They think we're giving the government a veto. We're not giving the government a veto. We're giving the government a chance to be heard. The fact is, our editors never have enough information to make an absolutely certain decision about when to publish. They're trying to see what's of value to the public. They're trying to understand the risks that may be posed by publishing, and that call to the government helps them do that. I'm aware of times when we've decided not to publish because of lives could be lost, or that there could be a sensitive and important source of information in the war against terrorism that shouldn't be disclosed. For the most part, though, our editors are really looking to publish when they can. We're in the business of publishing, not keeping secrets, and to doing that as responsible as we can. I think we usually have got that right, but it's really hard because so many things are classified now that don't need to be classified. And as a Supreme Court justice once said, when everything is classified, nothing is classified. All it does is encourage people to be cynical and careless in keeping real secrets. So we do that outreach. We do look to have honest discussions with the government before we publish truly sensitive stuff.
Thank you. As far as trends are concerned, in what seems to be an increasingly opinionated and segmented media, do you believe we are reaching a peak of polarization? And if so, do you see any trends that point to increased demand for objective truth and straight reporting?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I get asked it all the time. And there's no question there's greater partisanship, and there's no question that there is a lot of push and pull on what should the news organizations do, what should be their attitude. And within our organization, I write about this. There's a chapter in my book called Us Versus Us, which is about the cultural wars, even within newsrooms, between those many times younger journalists who think that we should be advocates and older journalists who think that that's not really our role, and that aligning with one side or the other is a really bad idea for America, for journalism, and ultimately for our business. That we should be in the business of reaching as many people as we can, and we believe that there is a market for stories that call it squarely, that pursue the truth as fairly and impartially as possible. Do we always get it right? No. I mean, obviously, it's an art. It's not a science, and so some stories we will get it wrong. But we try to be reflective about that. We have a corrections page. You don't see that on Twitter very much, and we try to set it right. If I could just add one thought to that, is that people inevitably ask me, "Can we get to a better place?" And I always say, "Yes, I'm optimistic we can." And then somebody pointed out that my entire book was a testament to misguided optimism. I always say it's going to be okay, and it's never okay. But here's why I think it's going to be okay, if I could. And that is, if you, like me, believe that there is a civility, that there is an open-mindedness that should fuel our public debate and our public controversy and the way we disagree with each other, I take hope in this. We don't start at zero. There are a lot of us who believe that. And we don't have to get to 100%. We don't have to convince everybody of it, right? So what we need to do is take that group of people who already believe that, find a few others who are willing to stand up and do that as well. And if we can get to a critical mass, I do think we can get away from some of the toxic nature of civic discussion that we've had over the last few years.
Thank you. This is something we were talking about a little bit earlier this morning. Can you share with everyone here today your thoughts on how the newspaper business is going to evolve, what you in your mind think it's going to look like, and what we should be prepared for?
Yeah, so it's a really hard call here, but I think one of the things that we've seen at the New York Times, and I think this is also true with the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and others, and a few others, is that you're going to get a stratified market. I think those organizations, like the Journal, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, who are providing value to consumers, will find that people are willing to pay. I fear that the great crisis is going to be in the rest of the market, and especially in local journalism. I'm the head of a New York State Bar Association task force on the future of local journalism, an unlikely thing for lawyers and people in the legal community to focus on. But we now have so many places where there is no effective local news organization covering community. We have what we can think of as news deserts. An interesting academic study found that in places that had lost their daily newspaper, or their daily newspaper had closed, municipal budgets increased. I don't think that's by chance. And so in my mind, the great challenge is to try to save local news. I think that the relationship between major news organizations and platforms is still a work in progress. Last week, Facebook announced that they were going to start paying the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others for content to put on their news feed. That's an important breakthrough. It certainly makes more sense than them just stealing it. They don't see it that way, that's an editorial comment, but just essentially, using it and linking back to us. And so all of that we think is a really positive step forward, but that's going to be the real challenge, is how we survive at a time when the ad market is going to really be dominated by the digital platforms.
Thank you. 2 more questions. We've had several questions about whistleblowers. So can you talk a little bit about, especially with the case we're all dealing with on a national level, the value of a whistleblower? Do you think a person should step forward when they're going to be threatened with treason? And if you knew who the whistleblower was, would you publish their name?
So let me take that step by step and begin with a simple proposition. We wish every story was fully disclosing of everybody in it. We wish for that. We want that. That's good for us. That's good for you. You get to know who our sources are. We get to tell you that, and then we're adding news. We're adding information. That's simply not possible, and that there are some times when anonymous sources are necessary. And we have a whole system in place, that is that an editor has to know who the person is. We don't leave it up to a reporter to make that call by herself or by himself. And we try everything possible to work around that, so we don't have to rely on anonymous sources. But it's necessary, and it's necessary when someone has something important to say to the public and is threatened with losing a job, threatened with treason, or whatever it might be. Whether we name somebody is a complicated set of facts. We have chosen, our editors have chosen not to name the whistleblower at the heart of the Ukraine matter, and that is a conscious choice about concerns that I think his lawyers have expressed to our editors about his safety, and we would take those all in. In all of these, again, it's an art, it's not a science. We try to understand what it would mean to you, the reading public. We try to understand what it would mean to the source, and we try to understand what greater good would be served by naming. So the facts can shift, and we would get to a different place, but I certainly understand the need for anonymous sources.
Final question. This hints a little bit to a comment you made earlier. What's your opinion about allowing Facebook to publish obviously false and doctored information? Okay,
that's a hard one. So Facebook has been grappling with these issues ever since the revelations from the 2016 elections, when they finally acknowledged that somewhere around 130 million people were reached by Russian disinformation and misinformation. As I talk about in the book, initially Facebook acted as if it had nothing to do with Facebook. It's sort of like that person who slams on his brakes and there's a 136 car crash behind it and looks in his rearview mirror and goes, "Nobody can drive here." I wonder how that happened. So they've been struggling with it, about what to do, and their rules are evolving. They now have said that systematic campaigns of disinformation they'll take down, individual false information from political candidates they're going to leave up. They feel that there's value in that, and they make an impassioned discussion, an impassioned plea for why they think that's the proper exercise of their First Amendment rights. So my view, again, speaking not for the New York Times, but as a person who follows these things, I think that taking things down should be an extreme step. I think labeling things should be an obvious step. I think helping people understand when they're seeing things that are fake news that have been planted by foreign operatives, labeling that, making it clear to readers, directing readers on Facebook and elsewhere to where they can find legitimate news or contradictory stories is an important thing. I'm always a little always a little uncomfortable with the idea of taking things down, because I do wonder who will police the policeman when that happens. The one thing I want to leave you with, I'll stress, is that it's not as obvious as you might think cause and effect here. One of the first studies from 2017 about fake news found that the heaviest users of fake news were also heavy users of mainstream media. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether they read some incredible story about Martians on a fake news site, then go to the New York Times and go, aha, they didn't cover it, or whether they're going like, that sounds a little bit wrong, this thing about the Martians, let's go see if the Times has it. I don't know. But people are complicated, and just because they're exposed to fake news doesn't mean that they then act upon it, believe it, vote on it. Some do, but we are complicated in how we make decisions. In my view, the real problem with the amount of disinformation and fake news online is how it encourages people to give up. There's just so much stuff out there you're trying to sort out. You have a life, you have a mortgage, you have a family, you have kids, you have other things, you have a job, you have other things to do. And being a citizen of this country has never been harder. It's never required more. And I just fear that a lot of the fake news helps contribute to the sense that it's all hopeless. But as I said, I'm an optimist. It's going to be okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed today's program as much as I did.